Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the relevant radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. Coming up, we're going to be discussing how to save your marriage when intimacy is an issue, especially for the wife. Gentlemen, you need to listen. It's a really important conversation. I was reading a recent article from the Huffington Post. I hired a sex worker to save my marriage. Here's how it changed our lives. Definitely a topic to be addressed. I mean, this isn't just something coming out on the Huffington Post, but it's also something that was recently featured in Gwyneth Paltrow's Netflix series Sex, Love, and Goop. So we're going to talk about that a little later here on the show. Joining me now is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras, and he is the national leading expert when it comes to tech addiction. He's a founder and CEO of Omega Recovery, and he also hosts various health, recovery programs as well, but he's the author of a book I have discussed here with him on the show, and that is Glow Kids, How to Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trance. We're going to discuss the impact of screen and tech use on intimacy and relationships and communication just a little bit, but before we go there, you have probably been following a little bit of the buzz surrounding Metaverse. Some people are completely perplexed and don't get it. Other are all in, moving to digital currency, digital avatar, you name it. You might be asking the question, well, what exactly is Metaverse? I thought Meta was Facebook, and this is something Mark Zuckerberg's talking about. Well, here's the deal. It's a new phrase that's been coined by Mark Zuckerberg. And the whole idea, essentially, in order to help you understand it, you can basically think of it as replacing the words the metaverse in any thought or sentence with the words cyberspace. Most of the time, this will fit this understanding that's basically creating a cyber world. We're talking about essentially, and I think this is important, a play reality. It is a game, but people are trying to make it seem as if this is real life, where you need an avatar. It's all about entertainment, though. And we'll talk about some examples of this with virtual reality and augmented reality. You saw an example even in Pokemon Go. It gives you a glimpse of it. But joining me now, as I mentioned before, is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras, and he has a lot to say about what's going on with the metaverse in the future that we're trending toward. Dr. Kardaras, welcome to Trending. Please share your just kind of initial thoughts, helping us to wrap our heads around the metaverse and why you see this as concerning.
Yeah, hey, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. Yeah, I think it's quite a bit more problematic than it just being a virtual game. And for us to even think of it as a cyber reality, I think we should actually plug in the word the Matrix more appropriately than cyberspace, because Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want us to just pop in and out of the metaverse. He wants us to actually live our lives through what he calls a shared reality, which he would curate. This is an immersive, augmented, and virtual space that he wants us to live our lives through. And I went through one of their demonstrations to see when you put the glasses on, you're you are essentially, he calls it an embodied internet. You're living through this embodied world where things materialize holographically and augmented things. So you could swipe your hand and, things can materialize. You can swipe here, swipe left, this happens, and swipe there. But essentially, it's a synthetic reality that he wants us to really, he wants to get at least 1 billion people on the metaverse in the next 5 years. And again, not part-time. He wants us to wake up in the morning, put on the visor, and live our lives in this world. So it's a little bit more problematic than just, let's pop in for an hour or two to play a game. So, of course, I'm concerned about somebody like Mark Zuckerberg creating a quote-unquote shared reality that you and I and other people that he's trying to seduce into, that he would monetize, he would data mine, that he would control. No, thank you.
Right. So I think that this is shocking to some people because it's not quite what they expected the metaverse to be, thinking it was just a game, that it is much more than that. It is living in a non-reality, but in reality, and eventually, essentially always wearing these virtual reality glasses. It's funny because I think in a certain respect, the game Pokemon Go gives us a glimpse of what this is, in the respect that everyone thought it was kind of odd that people are walking around with their heads in their phones, was stopping sometimes in the middle of a street to get points in this game. But this is essentially what the metaverse is, but you're living in it every single day. How would that play out, let's say, if you're working throughout the day? Or how does this play out for it actually being a reality? And is the technology there for this?
Yeah, and by the way, I'll give you this is the exact quote from Mark Zuckerberg. Think about how many things that are in your life that don't actually need to be physical and could be easily replaced by a digital hologram in a world where you had glasses. And he said that at a 2021 conference, the Viva Tech conference in Paris. He wants to replace the physical world with a synthetic reality. I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say the Matrix. We need to understand a little bit more about Mark Zuckerberg, because in the new book that I've just submitted to my publisher that's coming out in a couple of months, I really had to do a deep dive to understand the psyche of Mark Zuckerberg. This is a man who's obsessed with Caesar Augustus, grew up obsessed with him. On his honeymoon, they visited Rome with his wife, and they went to every Augustus statue. They named their daughter August. At the end of each Facebook meeting, he used to scream out at the top of his lungs, "Domination." And there was a writer in The Atlantic who wrote a really insightful article called Facebook Land. And how Mark Zuckerberg really views Facebook, and now let's call it the metaverse, as a Roman emperor would, as a form of conquest. And what Zuckerberg had been lacking before the metaverse, he had a dominion, he had his citizens, his denizens, his Facebook dominion, which grew from 200 million to 1.2 billion citizens, or whatever you want to call his Facebook followers. They created a cyber currency, so he had currency, his own money. What they were lacking was land. This Atlantic author had talked about, he didn't have land. And before I had heard about the metaverse, I said, well, that's it. He's going to butt his head up against that. He's never going to be able to sort of acquire an actual empire. And then all the news started coming out about the metaverse. And this is, I believe, his attempt, this egomaniac's attempt to really create his own empire. And it's an empire that we would, be the citizens within, and that he would control. And again, he's curating this reality. And what I mean by that is he's controlling what we would see and what we would experience. And he would make it so seductive. And here's the trap. Here's always the addictive, illusory trap, that why would we want to leave it? Because it's going to be more stimulating and immersive and more bells and whistles. The real world is painful. The real world can have rough edges. The real world can be not always pretty. And so if we have a seductive synthetic reality to escape to, I'm afraid that many people would choose to live there and want to live there and want to be subjugated. And it almost would be a form of Stockholm syndrome, where you would want to be held hostage by our big tech overlord.
It's interesting because you follow stories such as, here's Mark Zuckerberg getting to kind of the behind the scenes of who this man is and what he wants to create. And then you also have people such as Elon Musk with his brain chip.
Hmm.
Both of them kind of have this commonality where they're both trying to seek almost a painless world in this virtual
Hmm.
non-reality, or kind of trying to ease and change in a certain respect who the human person is. And I know that it's come out that there is a level of autism for specifically Elon Musk. Is this part of Mark Zuckerberg's story as well? And do you think this plays into this virtual reality world that he wants us to live in?
I don't like to diagnose without, from a distance, but undeniably he shows, because I work a lot with autism, and undeniably Mark Zuckerberg shows a lot of the markers of people on the spectrum. And
Right.
it would make sense because he himself is so socially challenged that what better way to overcome that disability than by creating a social environment that he's the emperor of.
Right. And comfortable.
It's frightening. And,
Yeah.
and I was going to talk about, the pilot episode of Star Trek. The original Star Trek in 1966 was this episode where they went to this planet where these aliens were able to control your thoughts and create a virtual reality world. And Captain Pike in Star Trek was horribly burned, and he was given the choice of living his real life as a paralyzed quadriplegic or living this synthetic life where he looked young and healthy and had a beautiful wife and had all the things that we would want. And of course he chose the synthetic life because, if your day-to-day life is so untenable, I think many people might choose that. The challenge is he's trying to make all of us reject our day-to-day lives to enter the world that he controls and he monetizes and he data mines. Timmerie, I was going to ask you to ask me about the VR cow, the virtual reality cow.
Yes, please tell us about using these glasses.
Well, because this ties in to the metaverse. When I was writing my most recent book, After Glow Kids, it's digital madness, how big tech is driving our mental health pandemic. And I was speaking at a conference in San Francisco in 2019, and this conference was called Humanity at a Crossroads. And it was myself and a couple of others. There was 4 or 5 scientists from around the world, and there were presentations about everything from the challenges of AI to 5G and radiation effects. And I, of course, was talking about mental health impacts with technology. And one of the presenters was from Norway. And during his presentation, he showed a slide of a cow with a virtual reality headset on. And everybody in the audience, now this was the Commonwealth Club. This is a very famous, it's the country's oldest public forum place to speak. FDR spoke there. It's a really historic building and it's a beautiful setting. And there were about 300 people in the audience. So everybody looked at this surreal slide of a cow wearing a virtual reality headset. Everybody laughed initially. And then once everybody stopped laughing, he explained that they were experimenting with putting cows in virtual reality headsets because what they found was that if you can trick a cow to think that it's free range and in a nicer climate and spaced out grazing, they produce more milk, even though the cow's reality might be that they're side by side in their own feces and this untenable barbaric reality. But you can trick the cow to be more productive. And at the time I was writing my book and I said, is this the direction that things might be going with big tech? And I was viewing it more as a metaphor. And then Mark Zuckerberg came out with his metaverse idea, and I realized that my cow in the virtual reality headset wasn't so much of a metaphor as a canary in a coal mine or a precursor to what might be happening to us.
Wow.
I'm afraid that it's an intersection that we could lose our humanity and that will be so potentially seductive and so controlled that it'll be hard to ever get out of it if it were to become as pervasive as he wants it to be.
The worldwide crisis and pandemic of the last couple of years, I know, has brought to mind for many people saying, that we're sheep. We kind of just follow what other people are doing. And you look at this and maybe we'll become
right.
cows instead, looking at this virtual reality for cows, and to actually be able to trick them into thinking that they're free range, nicer weather, and lots of space when they're really side by side in their filth, like you said, eating feed that's terrible for them, terrible for the people who are eating them. And then yet that virtual reality of wearing those glasses produces additional milk. It's interesting because on one respect, you could say, okay, well, the cow is functioning more optimally how it's supposed to produce what's necessary for the human person. And I have a problem with doing tests on animals like this to begin with. However, what we're saying is this is actually being done already and going to be done on humans. And we're not tools.
What if
We're
the cow is
not
the beta test,
experiments.
right?
Go ahead.
The cow is the beta test, and we're next. And
Yes.
that's my concern. And I don't mean to be, melodramatic about it, but again, if you get into the psyche and psychology of some of these 5 or 6 tech oligarchs, they have God complexes and they are megalomaniacs from Gates on down. And again, I did a pretty deep dive into their childhoods and into their histories. They look like the Geek Squad, but they are ruthless and they have an agenda. And they're
again,
sugarcoating their agenda, and
right.
a lot of us are falling for the sugar, but it's dangerous. It's quite dangerous.
And
We're seeing it right now. We're seeing that social media shapes how we think, how we vote, how we react to things. Social media, their current digital monster that they've created, the social media polarization and algorithm fueled organism that they've created that shapes our thought processes, entirely can brainwash people left or right, whichever end of the political spectrum you're on. Nobody ever expected this of social media to become this thing. People, Facebook started. Let's remember how Facebook started. Facebook started as a Harvard dorm
College
side
students.
project, Hot or Not, by Mark Zuckerberg,
Right.
for him to misogynistically rate the appearance of women.
Right.
And now it's turned into the monolith that it's become.
Yeah. Yeah. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. That's Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. He is a leading tech addiction expert in the nation. He's also the founder and CEO of Omega Recovery. He wrote the book, one of my favorite books over the last number of years, and we finally are having conversations with him. It's called Glow Kids, How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trends. It's an excellent resource. We'll include a link to the podcast where we took a deep dive with Dr. Kardaras into the specific screen addiction for children, how to work through it. Let's talk a little bit more about data mining as well as some of the downside of kind of really understanding the downside of augmented and virtual realities.
Well, so developmentally, depending on how old you are, if you're a child, that's, again, Pokemon Go was sort of innocent enough, but the metaverse is Pokemon Go times 1,000 on steroids. Pokemon Go is augmented reality, so augmented reality means you're seeing things within the real landscape that aren't there, and virtual reality is a totally synthetic reality. So developmentally, if you're a kid, psychologists, we call it our ability to reality test or reality testing. It's a sign of sanity, where we begin to differentiate what we see on TV versus what's real and what's not real. And that happens during key developmental stages, typically between the ages of 3, 4, 5, up till about 7 or 8 years old. A child begins to discern what I'm watching on TV is not real, what I'm living in real life is real. But the more you blur that line, the more reality blurring some of these experiences are, like Pokemon Go or like the metaverse will be, the more challenging it's going to be for younger children to begin to delineate where does the synthetic reality end and the real world begin. I've had quite a few young men that I've treated that had versions of video game psychosis where they couldn't tell where the game ended and where the real world began. And these were college-age young men. So what does that do to 7 and 8 year olds? And then, for us as adults, if you're in a bad marriage, you're in a job that you hate, you don't like your day-to-day life, and you can just sort of lose yourself in this alternate synthetic reality. Will you then put the work in to make your day-to-day reality more empowered? Or are you just going to raise the white flag and give in to the illusion, give in to the dream? That's my concern. And the technology is very close. It's very close to being applicable right now. They're beta testing some of it. You mentioned Elon Musk's neural chip. He sells it to us for paraplegics. Neuralink is being sold
Right.
as the opportunity to have.
Right. It could cure all these things.
That's we're always selling the good, but scientists would call it peril versus, there's an equation that you have to look at where you have to look at the peril versus the profit of it, or the peril versus the promise. I'm sorry, peril versus promise. So ostensibly Neuralink, if it helps a quadriplegic walk again, it's a wonderful thing. But is that the sugarcoating that he's selling us on? Because the other applications of it are not so good. There's other applications of a brain implant controlled at Data Central that are not so good. They had a special on the Today Show a few years ago where they were talking about people getting a chip implanted into their arms for identification at their company. And there was a company in Wisconsin that they were piloting this program. So you would get basically a subdermal chip, and it would allow you, instead of having to use an ID card, you'd walk into your building. They wouldn't do an iris recognition, but you had full access if you had the subdermal chip. And on that Today Show, it was so funny the way that they tried to sell this thing. They showed one of the employees going to the vending machine, and all he had to do was swipe his hand because the vending machine read the subdermal chip, and they gave him like a Snickers bar. And the reporter said, "Look at that. If you have a subdermal chip, you can get all the Snickers bars that you want." And it was so condescending and so patronizing that we're all going to want subdermal chips because, yes, there's going to be some, in this case, it was literally candy that we can get, without talking about some of the more nefarious implications that can happen. Because once you're in for a dollar, you're in for the whole ride. And there's a whole other applications, AI and otherwise, that are more nefarious that they don't explain to us because, it would make people more weary and leery. So...
And we know this is already technology use impacting the mental health of young people as well as adults today. But if you take it to the next level, put everyone in the metaverse, and what we're feeling and experiencing, or should I say not feeling and experiencing, because we're not processing emotions, we're not living in reality, is only going to make the mental health crisis worse. Yet, it's so funny because we throw mental health, those words out there as a real issue, and it is, but those same people who say it's an issue are very strongly behind the very objects and technologies that are leading to much of this damage today for young people as well as adults. We're going to talk in just a little bit about how communication and intimacy are impacted by tech, but I have a couple more questions, Dr. Kardaras. Before we go there, let's talk about data mining implications. What are your thoughts there?
Well, so we're already getting data mined up the wazoo just on two-dimensional screen applications. We're data mined perpetually. Shoshana Zuboff, the Harvard business professor, talked about digital exhaust. They data mine our digital exhaust, and that has a monetary value. So everything that we search, every search engine, every digital fingerprint that we leave has value because that's what gets sold in terms of our digital profiles. And so again, currently it's on a two-dimensional plane, and if you go on your phone or your laptop and you, whatever you're searching for, and we've all experienced it, right? You might randomly search for a pair of sneakers, and then all of a sudden for the next 2 days you keep getting random sneaker ads that pop up into whatever else you're searching for, because now the SEO optimization realizes what you're interested in for that particular period. But now if we're going to the metaverse, where it's a quote-unquote embodied internet, it's not just a two-dimensional, it's our whole lives are going to be essentially monitored and monetized in ways that I think could be really destructive. And really, we weren't meant to be monetized entities that are cows thinking that they're living free range, but meanwhile we're living in this synthetic reality. We were meant to be self-actualized, and if we have a religious belief, we were meant to, we have a spiritual dimension that needs to thrive and be nourished, and I believe that this does the opposite of that. I think this crushes the spiritual aspect of who we are. We know that psychologically the digital age has crushed us. Increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, because we're genetically hardwired for face-to-face socialization,
we're social
being
creatures.
Physically active, for being in community, and all the digital age has done is it's made us sedentary and isolated and digitally quarantined. and with the illusion of connection. And that was sort of, what's the old saying about the devil? The devil's greatest accomplishment is to convince the world that there is no devil. The digital age has convinced us that we're all connected. Meanwhile, it's profoundly disconnected us. It's disconnected us from other people, and it's disconnected us vertically, I would even hazard to say, to our spiritual
Absolutely.
birthright.
We had a caller who called in saying this cyber stuff is Satan. He's trying to misdirect us from the truth, from the Bible. That's what the caller said. And it's very profound to say that because it's true. Sometimes people think that when, people are afraid of, oh no, a new technology, a TV, getting your ears pierced, whatever it might be, it's evil. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is certain technologies created are actually moving us further and further away from functioning as we were created to by God as social human beings with an eternal soul made to be with him, to love and show love, not to escape from reality, not to escape pain. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie during our weekly marriage hour. We're going to come back with Dr. Nicholas Kardaras, and we're going to discuss how communication and intimacy are impacted by technology today. It's also our marriage hour. We're going to talk about how to save your marriage when intimacy becomes an issue, especially for the woman. This hour sponsored by Solidarity Health Share. Join thousands of members who choose life through ethical and affordable health care. Call now to see how much you can save. 855-954-5688.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
It's our weekly marriage hour today on Trending. We're going to discuss how to save your marriage when intimacy becomes a struggle, especially for the wife. So listen up, husbands and wives. It's an important conversation in today's world. Joining me now is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras, and we've been talking about the Metaverse and concerns regarding the Metaverse. Dr. Nicholas Kardaras is the leading national expert on technology addiction. He's the founder and CEO of Omega Recovery. You can find them at omegarecovery.org. We'll include a link in the podcast notes for today's show. I've loved his work for years, and we're finally talking to him. He has a book that I recommend parents listen up. It's titled Glow Kids, How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trans. In that book, he talks about real solutions. We actually took a deep dive into his work on this topic. So if you're concerned about your kid's tech use and want to get your kid back, we'll include a link to that both on social media now as well as in the podcast notes for today's show. Dr. Kardaras, as we've been talking about the Metaverse, I really want to talk about how we see a version of this in this synthetic shared reality known as the Second Life community. Can you share a little bit about that Second Life community?
Yeah, and I guess Second Life could be viewed as almost the precursor or the progenitor or the beta test of the Metaverse. Second Life was, again, a shared synthetic community that had, at one point, it had over 1 million users. And this was essentially, you would create an avatar that would interact with other avatars on this shared space. And in this shared space that mirrored reality, you had things like Starbucks and hardware stores and supermarkets and people dating. And typically what it looked like, it looked a little bit anime-ish. It didn't look quite as realistic as I think things are looking now. It looked a little bit cartoonish-y, but with some realism to it. But if you hated your life, you were, the cubicle dwelling accountant that didn't like your job, you could be a 6'5" rock star in Second Life, and you could have relationships, and you could be this alternate person. And interestingly, there was a case that I think that highlights what can go south with relationships when you're living and interacting in this kind of world. And this is putting aside the obvious, right? We know that communication interpersonally has been, a nuclear bomb has fallen on it. All we have to think about is, since we've been able to text how people's interpersonal communication's been with one another, right? I mean, how invasive does it feel when someone actually calls us now to speak to us when we've relied on, our little fingertips doing with text messaging? So our verbal skills have atrophied because we've relied on texting and email so much that we're losing the art of not just small talk, but the art of conversation. But that aside, in Second Life, there was a pretty groundbreaking case. It was a legal case a few years ago where there was a man who it was called the Second Life divorce, and your viewers can Google it if they want because it's interesting and it's illuminating. It was a man who was rather large and didn't like his day-to-day life, and he created literally a 6'5" rock star to be his avatar. And he met an equally, I'm trying to be cautious here with how I describe things, but a woman who was not that comfortable with who she was physically, and she created a very sexual avatar. I think it was a stripper, and the two of them met, and they met through Second Life, and they decided to get married. And he lived in England, and she lived in Australia, and she moved to England so they could live together. But they shared the same apartment. They got married, legally married in real life, but they would only interact with each other in their separate bedrooms through their avatars on Second Life. Wow. And eventually, she caught him in bed on Second Life with another avatar, with another female avatar. And so she sued him for divorce, for infidelity. And he said, wait a second, I haven't been unfaithful. This is just a game. And she said, not for us. This is how we live our world. This is not a game for us. This is our reality. And they went all the way up to the British version of the Supreme Court. And it was such a fascinating case of where we've come as a species, that people are having whole married relationships digitally. Just like as many teenagers are having, how many of us know teenagers that say, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, oh, I've never met them.
Right.
My boyfriend who I've only interacted with on social media, and and how problematic that is. So anyway, that's the Second Life story.
And it's interesting because even if you look at the Second Life story, I mean, that divorce case happened back, I believe, in 2008. And you look now at Second Life, these images look very realistic, even for being, digitized. And you look at the images, and it's interesting that you explained that this man created an avatar where he looks like a rock star, 6-foot rock star, and the women create avatars where they're extremely sexualized. Because if you look at the website itself, it's basically a sexual fantasy for women and men, but how women are portrayed. Mm-hmm. And for men, I mean, they're made to look like these strong, robust individuals. And it's funny because I thought we were trying to get away from that type of stereotype for both men and women, yet that's what we're living in many of these versions of virtual reality and video games that are being pushed on us as how we're supposed to move forward in life. So all of this being said, you shared a lot about Second Life and the challenges it's actually creating within the context of marriages and even divorce. Let's talk about, in your expert work, and if you're just joining us, with us now is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. He's the national expert on tech addiction, and I want to dive into how communication and intimacy are impacted by technology. How are you seeing this play out in your work?
Well, it's like I said earlier, it's we're going backwards, we're de-evolving in our communication abilities. They used to say, sociologists used to say that there were two things that defined us as human beings, that differentiated us from the animal kingdom. And one was our ability for language, and the second was our ability for compassion or empathy. And I would say that the digital age has dropped yet another nuclear bomb on both of those things as well. We've become, our communication skills have greatly atrophied. I work with a lot of young people, both in the treatment program and in educational settings. I was a professor for a long time. We have become less articulate, generally speaking. And then that translates over to not being able to express ourselves in intimate relationships. We can't express ourselves in a professional setting, and this tends to be generational. The younger we get, the younger a person gets, the more you'll find that they essentially speak and write versions of text speak, sort of sentence fragments, grammatically incorrect, half grunting, and
Half grunting.
and that doesn't really bode well for us. And I think it's also killed our compassion, because they have found that developmentally we develop mirror neurons neurologically that help us, that's where empathy lives. Empathy lives in our neurologically in our mirror neurons, and spiritually in a deeper place than that. And what we've seen is a lot of desensitized sociopathic types of behavior with kids who have grown up on screens and didn't really develop that interpersonal relational development that they needed to develop, because they were raised by a computer essentially. And so good luck being in a relationship. And so the other part that ties into this is things, you mentioned fantasy labs before, things like pornography. I've worked with 13 and 14-year-olds that have seen such hardcore pornography. I mean, forget, Hugh Hefner and Playboy of yesteryear, where, gone are the days when an adolescent boy might hide away a copy of Playboy. It's so graphic and so hardcore that for the first time now you have pediatricians who are treating what's now known as the epidemic of adolescent erectile dysfunction.
Right.
And so you have ED, teenage boys who this historically had never been an issue before, who are so desensitized to real intimacy, sexual intimacy, that they can't function because, I hate to be crude, but if you've seen hardcore pornography since you were 11 or 12 years old, and now you're going to the senior prom with a prom queen, good luck. Good luck having a genuinely intimate experience if you've grown up on such desensitizing sexual imagery.
And this is, I think, so important for us to discuss, because on two perspectives. One, you have a whole generation now that grew up on technology and have these underdeveloped brains, underdeveloped ability to speak, to communicate, to love, to experience empathy. And then on the other side, you also have adults who are being wowed by this new technology. They're wooed by it. And I even think of, a couple I was recently speaking to where the wife shared with me, and she's in her 60s, and she said that, you wouldn't think that technology would be the problem that it is for us as well. But she said, I was talking to my husband about my sister's cancer diagnosis, and he took out his phone and checked his email while I was talking to him. And she shared how much this hurt her, and that phone use has become a real area of concern in her own marriage, and she never would have expected it. And so how do we find that self-control again, whether it's someone who is, being exposed to brand new technology they never thought would have been created 40, 50 years ago, or the kid, now young adult, who's married and is probably struggling a little bit with how to communicate within marriage because of the lack of development from tech use.
Well, I love that example that you gave of the older couple too, because I think it shows that no matter what age you're at, the younger are more vulnerable because of obvious developmental reasons, but all of us are getting impacted. And I think we've all grown to some degree dependent on our gadgets. I mean, we handle the awkward space of quiet or that awkward in between silence by reaching for our phones. How many of us are waiting in the dentist's office and just reach for our phones? How many of us are having an unpleasant conversation and reach for our phones? It's our security blanket. It's our digital, we've talked in the past about digital babysitters. Well, it's our digital security blanket. It's not our babysitter, but we reach for it instinctively now because it distracts us and it numbs us in a very soothing way. The problem is, like any benzodiazepine, like Xanax or Valium, we develop a dependency on that nice soothing sedative. And that's a problem, because then we don't really develop our muscles, our resilience muscles, to kind of work through discomfort or awkwardness or relationships. All those things take effort, and screen time has taken away our ability to give effort, and more so teenagers than 50-year-olds, right? Because, if you're a certain age, you've already developed certain habits or traits in your life. But if you're growing up and you've grown up with this thing that's shaped you so much, you've swam in the oceans of instant gratification and overstimulation, right, then the real world just doesn't hold the candle to that.
It's
That's the
dissatisfying.
problem. That's what I worry about the
Yeah.
most.
Yeah. And that is a really, I think, good example because it is dissatisfying. The real world doesn't become as interesting because, for example, in that husband who was looking at his phone as his wife's talking to him about her sister's cancer diagnosis, his brain was firing with dopamine because he just received a notification. And that's why he turned to his phone. It was more pleasant to look at his phone in that moment than to have that difficult conversation with his wife, even if he said,
Sure.
well, I was just checking who it was from.
Sure, of course, and you can on a certain level you can understand it, right? It's an unpleasant. So if you have a choice, door number one is an unpleasant conversation, and door number two is an escapist little dopamine tickling. We understand it. I think we understand why it's so. But the problem is it's become so immersive and so pervasive that this isn't like the other feel goods of yesteryear. If you wanted to escape an unpleasant conversation 30 years ago, you might have a drink, or you might take a pill, or you might walk out of the room. Where now it's just so umbilically attached to us that it's so easy to just do that. And that's where my fear goes back to the metaverse, right? If we're already, well, let me back up. So a lot of the young teenagers and young adults that I work with are entirely ill-equipped to have a normal relationship because, as we all know, relationships take work and effort. And what are our young people averse to? Work and effort, because they haven't had to. So their resilience and their ability to sort of put in and have some stick-to-itivism, which both academics, career, and relationships require, are really hard. So many of my clients are the quote-unquote failure to launch young adults who are stuck in mom and dad's basement. They can't hold a job, they can't finish college, they can't maintain a relationship, and they've got no friends. So they just stay on their computer because that's the only world where they find some level of stimulation and success. And meanwhile, totally dysfunctional in reality. And we're getting more and more and more of that profile.
And speaking of failure to launch syndrome for our young men in particular, we just did a whole show on that. You can check it out in the podcast notes, relevantradio.com/trending, or wherever you catch your podcast. We're also going to include a link to the podcast that we just recently did with Dr. Nicholas Kardaras on taking back your kids from the digital world, concrete tips. Dr. Kardaras, thank you so much for taking the time from discussing what is facing us today with Metaverse to the challenges in communication in marriages. Your work, I highly recommend. You can find him and his book called Glow Kids, as well as his work that again, is a great resource for parents whose kids are perhaps struggling with various types of screen addiction and mental health. It's a very important topic that we must address, and you can find him at omegarecovery.org. That's omegarecovery.org. I'll be right back here on Trending to discuss how to save your marriage without approaching compromising ways to get there, especially when your wife is struggling, you as women are struggling with intimacy. Thank you to our longtime sponsor, Solidarity Health Share. Enroll now in Solidarity One, a new program with expanded options to fit any healthcare budget. Solidarity One offers access to prescription drugs and new discounts for seniors. Learn more about this exciting new healthcare at CatholicHealthShare.com.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Lent is almost here, and for some, this is the time where you start to take your Catholic faith seriously. Well, we have about 2 weeks to go before Lent begins, so we're going to start encouraging you on how to make that battle plan, that action plan for this Lent so you can grow in your faith, root out the bad habits, bad behaviors, and the outright sin that you may be struggling with to attach yourself to Christ. So stay tuned. We'll be diving into these topics in the weeks ahead. But if you want to take your Lent to the next level with Father Rocky's Lenten lessons on the Mass, it's free to you every single day of Lent. Because you loved last year's in-depth walk through the Mass, we produce even more new exclusive video content every day to enrich your passion for the Mass. So please, I'd encourage you to enjoy this from Ash Wednesday to Easter morning. Illuminate your Lent with daily insights you can only find here at Relevant Radio right in your inbox. So sign up for Father Rocky's new Lenten lessons on the Mass today at relevantradio.com/Lent and get ready to learn it, live it, love it, and even more. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. I wanted to take this time to talk about how to save your marriage and how intimacy can be a real struggle within marriage, especially for the wife. But in the limited time I have, I want to table this because I want to give the adequate amount of time to this discussion because I think it's important as we are seeing trends with shows such as Gwyneth Paltrow's Netflix series Sex, Love, and Goop. I think that as she's recommending these sex workers to help save marriages, that we need to address this because there is a real struggle, but we want to go to a healthy solutions, not solutions that are compromising for our marriage, compromising for ourselves and who we are as human people and how we're created. So stay tuned because it'll be a fantastic conversation yet to come. But before we go there later on this week, I want to talk today during our marriage hour about fear. I was reminded of this recently when the story came out just yesterday about the shark attack. Did you hear about this shark attack in Sydney, Australia? Yesterday, the remains were found off the beach in Sydney, Australia, of an individual who had been attacked by a 14-foot great white shark. Person is completely dead. Many people saw parts of what happened. It was atrocious. Pray for that family and anyone who saw it. But I was reminded for me, I have an extreme fear of sharks. And when I tell you an extreme fear of sharks, I'm talking like tiptoes into the water, not going super deep in. Ever, really very rare, and when I do, any little thing scares me. I will tell you, I have practically evacuated a beach once yelling shark when I think it was a dolphin. I'm that scared of sharks. But it made me think of what fears we can have that can be reasonable or unreasonable and how these can be taken into our relationships and dating. I threw a poll out on social media yesterday during our weekly gentleman's hour, and I was asking, like, men, what are you afraid of? Because some fears can be reasonable, some can be unreasonable. Whether it's spiders, whether it's sharks, whether it's Indiana Jones who was terrified of snakes, these things can really prevent us from functioning in life. And so we have to kind of walk through the reasonability or the irrationality of fear. And just kind of a couple thoughts on this, because as I was looking at some of the responses on social media, I kept thinking even of Indiana Jones. We know the classic adventure story where Indiana Jones is terrified of snakes. Yet in every single movie, we just see over and over again that specifically Indiana Jones has to face his fear, and somehow to accomplish the mission at hand, he has to grapple with a snake. Now, the reality is that in today's world, we tend to try to avoid our fears. We tend to just shut down at all costs. And when asking the question, what do you fear? Many men responded in one fear is failure. And I was thinking about it, you have two choices when failure is before you, if that's a concern. You can completely become immobile, non-functioning, and freeze up and just not do anything. Not try to succeed, not try to get a new job, not try to raise a family, not try to ask that woman out, not try anything. Not try to help out at your home when your spouse needs help. Or you could do the courageous thing, remembering that courage is to act in the face of fear. That doesn't mean that the fear is gone, doesn't mean that you will succeed. It means that you will reasonably act even when fear is present, even if failure is what you fear. One person commented that their fear is being alone. It's interesting because I think of the work of C.S. Lewis, and he talks about this idea of men without hearts. That is the idea that when we let fear essentially consume us, that we can become people who no longer have hearts. We shut off our hearts in a coffin in a tight box, not letting anyone in. We don't show love. We don't allow ourselves to experience love. And what this leads to is the atrophying of the human person. You close your heart off to the point where you've completely denied the reality of your humanity and the needs of both yourself and others. So that's one side of how you could react to the fear of being alone. On another side, you could overengage and focus so much on friendship that you lose yourself because you're constantly chasing the next friendship, the next thing you can do. You can even lose your friends because you're always chasing the next good thing to do or the next most ideal person you think that will love you most because you're afraid of being alone. And then there's the final option where you can choose to trust people, develop relationships, search even when it's difficult to make those friendships, to invest in your marriage, to not allow yourself to shut off your heart to others and allow yourself to actually indulge in your fear of being alone. So often when we have fear, we can indulge in them. We can indulge in them perhaps by me doing something such as I'm afraid of sharks. And I indulge in that fear when I watch, for example, Shark Week, or I read the stories of historic shark attacks. It's a great way to kind of really freak yourself out. However, it's one thing if you do it with something that's irrational and semi-rational with sharks or spiders, but it's another thing when we do it with things so serious as our fear of failure, or our fear of being alone, our fear of being inadequate. Fear is not of God. Courage is a virtue. Courage is to act in the face of fear. So don't let your marriage, your relationships, future relationships, your fear of loneliness get in the way of moving, of functioning, and being the person you are called and created to be by God. Do you or someone you love struggle with depression? You don't have to. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. Friday, I'll be joined by Beverly Thompson, the author of the book Antidepressed, a breakthrough examination of epidemic antidepressant harm and dependence. We'll also discuss the epidemic of ADHD and false diagnoses. Join me Friday at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.